Welcome to Your Education Matters, a source of information about British Columbian education. Your Education Matters features the voices of professional educators and other education stakeholders. Patti Bacchus is the chairperson of the Vancouver Board of Education. She is a graduate of Point Grey Secondary School, the University of Victoria in Political Science, and Langara College in Journalism. A longtime public education advocate with a background in communications and public relations, Ms. Bacchus currently has 2 children enrolled in secondary school. Before becoming a trustee, Patti served on the executives of the parent advisory councils at her children's schools and represented the councils on Vancouver district-wide reviews. As the former coordinator of Vancouver Parents for Successful Inclusion, Patti has also been a member of the district's Special Education Advisory Committee. We welcome Patti Bacchus to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Welcome back to Your Education Matters, Patti.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Good to see you again. It's a very dramatic year we're in the midst of in school business.
It's never dull. That was one of the first things the first superintendent I worked with said to me when I was elected is it's never dull, and he was absolutely right.
Well, I guess that's true. I wanted to start off by asking you about our meta question about our entire governance system, because it's been called into question in recent years whether or not we should have the trustee system we have and the boards of education elected as they are. I wondered what your current thoughts were about the system of 60 school districts and school boards in British Columbia.
Well, that's been a debate that's gone on for almost a century in BC. At one point there were far more school districts. Almost every school had a school board, and over the years that has been reduced somewhat. I think it was back in the mid-90s we went from 75 to 60 under an NDP government. And there were proposals then to reduce or consolidate boards even more. There's been discussion about regional appointed boards as opposed to locally elected boards. And I think some of what leads to that is a question about cost. People think that if you have fewer organizations, you might save some costs, and there may be something to that, although I don't think that has really been shown in places where we've seen consolidations. I think some of the frustrations are that boards don't have the powers that they used to. They don't levy taxes as they once did. They don't do their own direct negotiations on cost items with their employee groups. So they're kind of at the bottom of the political food chain in terms of very little power, but a lot of responsibility. I think on the positive is that local democratic voice and having citizens who represent citizens as lay people, setting direction at the school board level, working in that co-governance role with the provincial level. And I think that would be something people would miss. As school trustees, we take our calls, we talk to people, we meet with people, we consult. We spend a lot of time in neighborhoods talking about the unique features of the neighborhood and how we best meet those needs and how we allocate the resources we do have.
I have a feeling that buffer between the public and the government is one of the reasons why the system continues to go as it is, because I think people in Victoria realize that the school trustees are performing that function of liaising with their communities.
I think the school boards play a few roles depending on your political perspective. They can be sort of the people who have to go in and do the tough work. If there's a budget that has to be balanced, and of course school districts in BC must balance their budgets, have to make the difficult decisions locally, so it does buffer the provincial government somewhat from the direct impact. But also, I see it from the positive as a role to be advocates for that school district. And personally, as my role as a school trustee is I'm there to be the trustee, to look after that school district, to look out for its interests, to advocate for its needs, to take care of the resources and assets that it has, but ensure that it's well represented. And I don't know that you can do that at a provincial level or even a regional level as effectively.
Well, let's dig into some of those specifics you mentioned. What do you think about our current system of revenue raising, that it's entirely a provincial matter and the local boards have really not much to say about it? Do you think it's the best we can do, or is there some other policy that you have in mind?
Well, it used to be in BC that school boards could levy taxes. They set their own mill rate and they were accountable to their electorate about how much they were collecting in school tax. That did disappear through the 80s and 90s, and that has gone provincial. I think the benefit to it is, of course, an equity piece, is that different parts of the province have different capacity to raise taxes. And I certainly wouldn't want to be redesigning the funding system at the expense of another district. They all have needs. Being in Vancouver, we do have a much larger tax base, so Vancouver could, in theory, benefit from controlling its own funding, but I'm not sure that's the direction I want to see. You see some of that in the US, where you see different adjacent jurisdictions having very different funding levels, and that's not really my vision for this province, nor my school district. You know, I think the frustration is the commitment to funding schools, and we look at the provincial level, and the portion of the provincial spending that is going to public education is shrinking over time. So the argument isn't so much of how it's collected, but the amount that is collected and allocated back to districts.
Yeah, the voters' voice seems to be lost in the current system. On the other hand, as you say, in the US, the ratio can be as much as 4-to-1 in terms of the money spent on a child because they're in one city as opposed to the neighboring jurisdiction. But that's not to say there couldn't be compromises worked out, you know, guaranteeing a floor, let's say. But anyway, it has been detached here in British Columbia, and that leads to its own set of individual issues and problems, I suppose. Similarly, local bargaining versus provincial bargaining. What do you think of that trade-off?
Well, it's a really hot topic in BC right now. Of course, our teachers through the BCTF are advocating for increased local bargaining. In our district in Vancouver, we do find it very frustrating sometimes to work within the provincial structure. We think we can often find better local solutions by sitting down and having those strong relationships. We have quite positive relationships with our employee groups. We do have issues specific to our district that we think we can come up with local solutions, and we have done so with what we call our mid-contract modifications. The way we post and fill jobs wasn't making a lot of sense. It was frustrating on both sides, and we were able to sit down and work out a better way of doing that in terms of posting and filling jobs with our teaching staff. I think it's difficult within the funding structure to really shift fully to local bargaining because clearly we don't control the funding. So you can't bargain cost items, and so many items do end up having a cost associated with them. So that's the frustration. But as a locally elected official, more autonomy would certainly be something we would be looking for, because we think we can do a better job and focus our solutions on local challenges that may not be the same situation we see in other districts in the province. And even just to get back to the funding issue and the revenue model, and in BC, we do see different amounts of money allocated to different school districts. If we calculate out, you know, although we're based on a per student model, the supplementary grants can be quite significant, particularly some of the geographic factors. So we do end up with some districts that have 3 to 4 times as much funding as others. The gap between Vancouver and, say, Stikine is an extreme example, where it may be up to $27,000 or $28,000 per student, and justifiably so in many cases. There are different factors that those districts are far more expensive to operate. So we do have different funding coming out, and that is something I do think we can review and maybe do somewhat of a better job. And the BC School Trustees Association is in that process, working with the Ministry of how we do divide up the current funding in a fair and equitable way that reflects all of the needs and all of the district issues across the province.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit. The idea that we've outlined 3 or 4 problems so far that could use some policy examination. Is that examination taking place? Are the lines of communication open? Are the people who need to be in the room? Is there a political process to work through these kinds of issues so that we come to finer resolution?
I think the challenge in BC that we've seen of having the key partner groups working together exists. It's still a challenge. We've seen attempts at things like a learning roundtable where we weren't successful in this province of getting teachers participating in a meaningful way that they felt comfortable. I think that lack of trust between the key decision maker groups and the stakeholders is still a problem. We see it all the time when we're trying to look at how do we move forward, how do we, where is education going, how do we have that discussion in a respectful way, in a meaningful, collaborative way, when there's such a lack of trust at times, particularly between our provincial government and our largest employee group.
Yeah, that's what I sense, that we're out of one era and we're not quite into the next. And whether we can restore what sounds almost like a romantic ideal now, a zone of protection around public education, where we set aside some of our ideological or partisan persuasions and work together for the benefit of our children, which of course is our own benefit too. Whether that can happen or whether education will continue to be politicized and used as a wedge issue, I think is a central concern to a lot of us in education, because as we're saying, there are a number of these issues which don't seem to have experienced a lot of movement in recent past history. Now, the School Trustees Association has vehicles for dealing with this. There are groups within groups in the Trustees Association. How does the Trustees Association work to form its positions and to present its case to government?
The BC School Trustees Association meets annually, has an annual general meeting, and they consider motions from districts. So districts bring forward various resolutions that go through a legislative committee to determine if they're appropriate. And those become, if adopted by the members at the BC STA AGM, and there's a vote that's weighted depending on the size of the district. So Vancouver would have more votes, for example, than a smaller district. Once adopted, those become the positions of the organization. So we might, for example, take forward a resolution regarding carbon offsets, and that's an example we did last year, that you know, the carbon offsets purchased by school districts, that money should be going back into upgrading school buildings, not drifting off into the private sector. So that will become the official position of the BC School Trustees Association, and its role of its executive members is to present that case to the provincial government. Do
you have the sense that the Trustees Association does a good job of reaching consensus and formulating coherent positions, or are they riven with polarizing positions?
There's generally a robust debate, and there certainly are differences of opinion. It's 60 different school districts, and certainly different compositions. Even within individual boards, there can be diverse opinions on specific issues. Once adopted, it is a democratic process, and they're fairly civilized meetings. And once those positions are adopted, they are the position of the organization. I do hear some speculation about how much certain resolutions might be pushed forward versus others. A letter is written and we don't hear too much more about it, and some trustees would want to see a more vocal voice coming out of a louder voice coming out of the organization in terms of advocacy, and then there are others who think a more quieter diplomacy approach is better, and there's obviously different political differences and how trustees think that should be presented. But it is democratic, and the leadership is elected democratically. And I think by and large it tries to reflect a very diverse group of members.
Well, the feeling I get in my years here has been that the constituent stakeholder groups are able to function and debate, crystallize positions, and enter into the public sphere ready for formulation of policy. But the process hasn't been able to move fully to completion, as I say, because I think there's been a politicization of education, which is unfortunate. Of course, I'm biased as an educator, but I think the field is special and should be held to a higher standard in terms of partisanship. But my experience is concurrent with yours, that the trustees, who are probably the most diverse of the stakeholder groups, are, for example, able to come to consensus and present themselves in a coherent fashion before the public and government. We'll be back in a moment.
So we see it in our curriculums, we see it in our school policies, we see it that the schools in many ways have become a reflection of the politics of the Western world. We have identified particular school subjects at the expense of other ones because they're seen as being better for the individual to be successful. And if you're measuring success in terms of economics, then true.
What is a school? What does a school look like based on the ethic of care?
How can a teacher maintain an ethical, caring relationship with 30 or 40 kids at any given time?
What do you teach? How do you teach it? You know, do you just go into school and teach about care? Of course not, because you still have academic expectations of reading and writing and arithmetic.
How do we then promote a culture of caring or a consciousness? That's what this project or this journey has been about.
As chair of the board, Patti, you have a great vantage on what's being done that's new and interesting in the Vancouver schools. So I wonder if you could review with us a few of the things that have caught your recent attention.
Well, it's a very exciting time to be involved in public education, as you well know. And everything from the discussion of how do we move forward with expanded personalized learning options, looking at different models of the calendar, the school calendar. Do we go to a balanced year? We've been looking at, in Vancouver, establishing an Aboriginal focused school of choice, and that's an idea that really came to us from communities. We were approached multiple times by representatives in our Aboriginal communities in Vancouver saying, what about a mini school? What about a specialty school? We have a whole number of specialty schools in Vancouver involved in everything from hockey to fine arts to digital learning to theater. And what about that focus? And there's so much that we've learned, and there's so much knowledge that could be used to provide a different way of learning for students. So looking at how do you take a proposal like that forward in a meaningful, respectful way where you don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and that you draw a community into really guiding and directing how we go about that. So it's a huge challenge, but it's a really exciting one.
We followed this in Toronto, where they do have an African-centered school, and there's been talk about, I think, a Portuguese-centered school now, but as a person raised in America and coming to Canada, the debate was interesting to me because it flew in the face of Canadian multiculturalism. In America, this wouldn't have been an issue. There's been long-standing specialized schools according to ethnicity, including Native American and Black. But in Canada, I appreciate that it's a more controversial thing to do. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily have to be black and white in the way that it's articulated. I mean, there's measures, like the school in Toronto, I believe, is within another school, so the students aren't isolated from all contact with the other students.
The key to this particular proposal is that this is a school of choice for all students who want to learn through an Aboriginal lens, using Aboriginal ways of knowing and learning and teaching. Not necessarily all Aboriginal students, possibly that they would have preferred access if there were limited spaces, that there might be a range of students who would be interested in learning through that lens. We have students who choose to be in French immersion programs. We've just started a Mandarin program. We have students who like to learn through the arts. We have students who find sports as their way of, opening up. So we see this as part of that continuum, and given where we are on Coast Salish land. It's a rich history that has really, for the most part in education, not really been tapped. And we think it might offer a perspective and an approach that may be really effective, and not just for Aboriginal students, but for many students who would like a different way of going about their education.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine there are a fair number of parents and school personnel who would be glad to participate in something of a rotating calendar. It doesn't have to be imposed on everybody from day one.
We've initiated the discussion. We have a school calendar committee in the school district. We have been having some discussions looking at the balanced calendar and various models of a balanced year-round type of calendar. Some time ago, about a year and a half ago, we of course made budget reductions that meant 10 fewer days in the school year, purely for financial reasons. But at that point, looking at research and trying to get a sense of what the impact of that might be, what we really came across was not a lot of research to support the traditional school calendar, but some indicating there may be some benefits to a balanced calendar. So we're looking at that in a somewhat gentle way. We have some schools, smaller schools, that have expressed an interest in going in that direction, and we're certainly looking forward to having a discussion of how that might work. We see some models in other districts that I think have been quite successful, and that actually have waiting lists, and certainly is an option. So how we maneuver that, how we get toward that without causing disruption. We know for some families it won't work that have students in other schools or preschools and things. But there certainly seems to be a real interest in having the conversation and maybe starting small in a way that does provide some options for families, so they're not necessarily forced to be in a year-round school, that there would maybe be a neighboring one on the traditional calendar. But I think it's time. The traditional agrarian calendar doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. We have, I think, 14 or 15,000 students enroll in our summer programs every year in Vancouver. They're already doing it. My son went to summer school last year. He was quite happy to do so. It's, that summer is a long stretch for a lot of kids.
Well, I was going to say, from a pedagogical point of view, setting aside resource questions and so on, learners who have issues really decline a lot during the lapse in schooling. So is one of the elements of this design the option that would exist so that students didn't have so much of a drop-off in continuity in their schooling? They didn't have 2 months a year or more where there was no schooling?
Well, I'm not an academic in the way that you are, but my understanding of the research that's out there and the summaries that have been provided to the trustees is that there is some indication that particularly students at a lower socioeconomic level that have fewer options over those summer months do tend to slip behind, more likely than some of their more advantaged classmates who may be doing some enriching activities through the summer, traveling, going to museums, going to camps, and access to reading and resources, and those students may in fact be ahead when they come back in the fall. So that achievement gap widens, and that's something that we're very concerned about, is our sort of equity in the gap between students from different personal circumstances. So if we can close that gap, if we can particularly support our more vulnerable learners and being more successful just by rearranging a calendar, I think that's something we have to look at.
Mm-hmm. The ministry and the superintendents and others talk a lot about personalized learning now. It's one of the phrases that's in the air in British Columbia education. How does personalized learning connect with the sorts of innovations you're seeing in Vancouver School Board?
Well, we're quite proud of our many examples where we say personalized learning is already happening. We have, being a fairly large city, we are able to provide quite a rich diversity of programming. We have several alternative schools, we have mini schools, specialty programs, we have smaller schools that provide a different environment than a larger high school. We have everything, as I've mentioned, from Mandarin immersion to fine arts elementary schools to French immersion, international baccalaureate. In our high schools, there's a whole wide range of programming options. And I think the challenge is, when we want to talk about personalized learning, we already have about 10% of our students have individual education plans, students generally with special needs of some sort. It is difficult to properly support and resource those plans. We hear that again and again. The best laid plans, the best IEP is only effective if we have the resources to support that. So I do think moving forward and expanding that personalized learning, that making sure every student has access to a really personal experience that really engages them and excites them, is going to take some resources and some staffing to have that kind of time to spend with those students.
The interesting thing to me about the funding shortfalls is that they're not very great on the marginal side. You know, they amount to half the cost of the BC Place Dome on a province-wide level. 10%, 15% more money would allow school districts to do the sorts of things they want to do. I don't know if that's the way you see it, but when I looked at the numbers, that seemed to be really what the shortfall was. It's
you know, there's that little piece between, and it's not so little though when it adds up, between what it costs to maintain services from year to year and what the funding is provided. So each year we see costs go up due to collective agreement increases that are determined provincially, inflation, new requirements on school boards, whether it's carbon offset purchase or calculation, insurance premiums that were once paid by the ministry are just quietly shifted over. So we've seen a number of costs shifted over that used to be on the province's books that find themselves on a school board's books, and the funding doesn't change. The costs of employee benefits tend to go up fairly steadily, but we don't see funding to reflect that. So that gap each year between maintaining the previous year's service and balancing the budget means each year we're shaving something off. And it's the compounded effect is quite significant. In Vancouver, it's accumulated up to $70 or $80 million over the last 10 years per year. So for us in Vancouver to get back to a service level equivalent and adjusted for enrollment of, say, 2002 or 3, we would need you know, $70 million just in our budget. That translates to probably $700 million provincially, because we're about 10% of the budget.
Well, that's been my observation too, and if somebody wants to step into the role of education premier, then that's probably the price tag to put us on the pathway not to just being good or maintaining, but to being able to aspire to the highest levels internationally in K-12 education?
I think it's that shift in thinking of looking at education as an expense item on the budget as an investment, and we know the returns. I mean, the reason why we have a public education system and virtually everybody supports public education is just how much are you willing to put up to support it. We know it benefits, and we know the costs of not graduating for each student are quite staggering for all of us in the lifetime costs to the system versus getting more students through. We think we could be more successful. We have fairly flat graduation rates right now at about 80%. We need to do better. We can't afford to have 20% of students not graduating, but it's an investment and we can't keep taking away bit by bit each year. It's time to recommit to that. And I think there would be the financial benefit. It may not be in that tight provincial election cycle that a premier or a politician might see, but I think overall as a society we would strongly benefit from that.
Thank you very much for sharing your time and ideas with us today, Patti.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. Elected school trustees are a foundation of our democracy. We entrust any number of responsibilities to appointed officials and elected legislators and local leaders, but we have reserved our public schools for direct local control by the voters. As an educator, I can appreciate the reason why. We entrust our children to our public schools. We enter into a delicate balance of inviting others into the raising of our children, but we do so with special concern. We let go of control of the rearing of our children with considerable reservations, and yet most of us recognize that our children need a broader, more technical understanding of our culture than we can give them alone. So we have created the role of local school trustee, designated local elected officials who will act in our place to oversee the schools our teachers and administrators create. The school trustee role is a unique one. It is an expression of democracy in action. As an educator, I am pleased to witness this special connection between the community and the schools. Elected local school boards are an institution that works. We need more democracy that works as well. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters.